Everybody, my name is Louise Faker and this is my journal club presentation. In the course of this presentation, I'll be giving you a background of the article. I'll be talking about the methods used within the article, the results obtained in interpreting them. I'll be analyzing the strengths, weaknesses, limitations to the study, and how the study could be applied in the real high-performance environment. Okay, so the title of the article is Biomechanical Measures of Neuromuscular Control and Valgus of the Knee Predict Anterior Cruciate Ligament Injury Risks in Female Athletes, a prospective study. It was conducted by Hewer and colleagues back in 2005 and was published in the Journal of Sports Medicine. Okay, just to give you a bit of a statistical background on the occurrence of ACL injuries. So you can see on the top graph there, most ACL injuries are suffered in sports that involve change in direction. So these include sports such as soccer, basketball, volleyball, really any sport that is field or court based. In the second graph there, you can see that ACL injury occurrences are non-contact in nature. This could be done in jumping tasks, cutting, or even just kicking a ball. And females are 2 to 8 times more likely to sustain an ACL injury than males. Why? There are plenty of reasons why, and they'll be further discussed throughout the presentation. Okay, so a bit of background on the article. A literature review by Hewer in the 2000 basically summarized all the literature that had been done up to that point in time. There were 3 theories that researchers had come up with that they had thought or proved why ACL injury occurrence was more prominent in females. Anatomy. This includes things such as increased Q angle in the females, pelvic structure, the alignment of the lower extremity, the femoral notch width. Neuromuscular. This involves theories of females having more ligament dominant injuries, and the muscle recruitment specifically around the hamstrings and quadriceps, and hormones as well. Estrogen, progesterone, and relaxin, these have been shown to have links with ACL injury in females. Now, looking at all of these possible theories and what has been proven, neuromuscular characteristics has the greatest potential for intervention because it can be modified through intervention. You can't really change someone's anatomy or their hormones. You can't just change that. So the neuromuscular aspects of these theories is more modifiable. So therefore, Hewitt and colleagues in 2005 thought to look at the neuromuscular and biomechanical characteristics of females to determine what was specifically causing these increases in non-contact ACL injuries in females. They hypothesized that the females who went into ACL injury would demonstrate consistent neuromuscular control differences that manifest in their lower limb biomechanics during jump landing tasks. The biomechanical measures could be used to predict the ACL injury risks with high sensitivity and specificity. So you could say that they wanted to find the exact neuromuscular control deficits in females that caused the ACL injury, and that they wanted to prove that their findings were significant enough that practitioners could use these to predict ACL injury in female athletes. Okay, so now to look at the methods that the authors used. So the study was a controlled cohort prospective study. It involved 205 female adolescent athletes who are involved in soccer, basketball, and volleyball. 9 out of the 205 females suffered from an ACL injury during the course of the study. The participants were screened by a 3D biomechanical analysis before the seasons began. Testing protocol involving It involved placing 25 retroreflective markers on specific anatomical locations as shown in the middle figure over there. Each individual had to take a stationary trial to begin with, where they basically just stood in a stationary position, anatomical stationary position, and global coordinates were taken. This was done so that they could take into account inter-subject variation. Each subject performed 3 successful jumps, vertical jumps on a 31 centimeter height box onto 2 force plates. So if you look at the next example, that photo, so you can see they start on the box, they jump onto the 2 force plates, and then they do a maximum vertical jump again, landing on the 2 force plates. So what the authors were quantifying during the biomechanical analysis were flexion, extension, and adduction, abduction of the knee, vertical ground reaction forces, so they could identify initial contact and toe off for the jump. They also took into account and calculated knee flexion, extension, adduction, abduction angles at initial contact, and maximum abduction and flexion angles at the stance phase. This was recorded for each jump trial. After this 3D biomechanical analysis, the subjects or participants were followed for a 13-month period. During this 13-month period, certified athletic trainers submitted weekly team and individual injury reports. Team reports included number of practice and competition exposures. Individual reports reported types and mechanisms of injury, and also they noted on if the person did suffer from injury, how long would they out for from training and competition. And now to discuss the results that were obtained by the authors. The statistics that they used were the means and standard deviations for all measured variables. Variance tests were used to compare values between subject groups, so injured versus non-injured. The injured group had 9 athletes, while the non-injured group had 196. Paired t-tests were used to calculate differences between limbs, and Pearson correlation tests or was calculated to see if there were correlations between parameters. Okay, so looking there, this is a figure obtained from the actual article itself. It is comparing the joint kinematics during the vertical jump between the two groups. So you can see on the top you have the non-injured athletes, and at the bottom you have the ACL injured athletes. There was no difference in the knee flexion angle at initial contact between the groups. However, there was a 10.5 degree difference in the maximum knee flexion angle during the landing in the non-injured cohort. Knee flexion angles have been correlated with ACL injury before, which can mean that more flexion is less likely to result in the injury. There were significant correlations between peak knee abduction angles and peak vertical ground reaction forces in the injured athletes, meaning that high forces are translated through the knee when it is not flexed enough and abducted, which could lead to an ACL injury. Okay, so a few more results. These tables were also obtained from the article. So if you look at figure 6 there, in the y-axis you can see that it's showing external moments in Newton meters caused by the knee and the hip. In the x-axis you can see that it represents the hip and the knee. And if you look carefully, there's a middle line there. On the bottom of the middle line it represents abduction, while the top of the line represents adduction. So the authors found that females who were injured had a greater peak external knee abduction moment compared to the uninjured. And you can see that by the asterisks. There's those 3 asterisks there next to the knee in the ACL injured. That represents significance. Furthermore, they found that there was a correlation between hip adduction and knee abduction moments. So now moving on to figure 7 there. Figure 7 is comparing the vertical ground reaction forces and stance time as a percentage in the injured and non-injured athletes. As you can see, in the y-axis you have the external moment in Newton meters, and in the x-axis you have the percent of time in certain phases of the movement. They found that vertical ground reaction forces was 20% higher in the injured athletes, and there was a significant correlation between knee abduction moments and angle with the peak ground reaction forces in the injured. They also found that peak external hip flexion moment was greater in the injured in comparison to the non-injured. So from what we can gather so far in these findings, in these results, that external knee abduction, hip adduction, and high vertical ground reaction forces are all correlated with injury. Now if you look at figure 8, that is comparing leg-to-leg differences between the two groups. There was significant leg-to-leg differences in the knee load in the injured athletes, but not in the uninjured. There was side-to-side knee abduction moments that were significantly greater in the injured athletes compared to the uninjured. Knee abduction moments, which contribute to dynamic knee valgus and knee joint load, had a higher sensitivity and specificity to ACL injury. So from what we can conclude from these results obtained is that ACL injury is associated or correlated with high vertical ground reaction forces, low flexion angles, knee abduction and hip adduction, and that there may be significant limb-to-limb differences in the injured athletes. And furthermore from that, knee abduction moments and joint load have a high sensitivity and specificity. Okay, so hopefully so far you've got an idea of what the authors were trying to do, how they went about in getting the results, and what they actually found, and what type of findings actually correlate to ACL injury. With that being said, it's not the best paper in the world. There are obvious strengths and limitations to the article. I'll start by stating some strengths. Strengths were that the authors were able to identify specific neuromuscular and biomechanical risks that are involved in ACL injuries in females. They established that knee valgus was the main risk factor in lower extremity biomechanics that led to the ACL injuries. So the authors did answer both of their hypotheses in saying that pre-screened females did demonstrate decreased neuromuscular control in knee valgus, and that the measures found to cause the dynamic knee valgus, which were knee abduction moments and joint load, that they had a high specificity and sensitivity to predict ACL injuries in females. However, there were limitations. The use of 3D biomechanical analysis isn't applicable in the real world situation. This type of analysis takes a lot of time, can cost a lot, and not many sporting teams have access to this type of technology, and I don't really see its real life application because of those reasons. Also, the study period wasn't long enough to take enough information. During the 13-month follow-up surveillance period, the authors should have taken more things into account, I think. Does only looking at training and the amount of training and the amount of games that they play, and then looking at how they took how the type of mechanism and how long they were out of play, is that sufficient information for them to gather that knee valgus alone is the only sort of risk factor for females to suffer an ACL injury. I think they should have taken other things into consideration, like training age, training history, session load, fatigue. They should have taken other things into account that could have led to the ACL injury occurring besides knee valgus. Yes, they were looking specifically at the biomechanics, but did fatigue, for example, influence the way they were playing? Therefore, they somehow, when they were taking a step, they created more knee valgus in the knee because they were too tired and they couldn't have proper knee valgus. Like, they could have taken into more account something like fatigue and training load, just to get more of an idea around it. Just biomechanics alone isn't gonna say yes, this is why females suffer ACL injuries, because they have knee valgus. But yeah, just something. So, can this study be implemented in the high performance environment? Can the methods that we use in the study be used in the high performance environment? The test protocol that was used, in my opinion, cannot really be applied in the high performance environment. Not many sporting teams will have access to this type of technology. 3D biomechanical analysis is more type of like university kind of thing. But the authors did establish benchmarks for practitioners to look for in their athletes to detect early risks in ACL injury. How would you use the findings of this study in the real world? You could use the findings of the study by establishing tests that could actually be used in the real high-performance environment to detect neuromuscular control deficits, such as dynamic knee valgus in female athletes, but not only female athletes, you can use it for male athletes as well. As I said before, it is a fairly old study. It's about 10 years now. Since then, there has been some development in actual tests that could be used in the actual high performance environment that practitioners can use to identify risks in ACL injuries. Dr. Andy Franklin Miller has done a lot of work on this area since the time of publication of Hewitt and colleagues' article in 2005. Dr. Miller, with help of his colleagues, has established 4 tests: single leg squat, drop landing, sagittal coronal hops, and standing vertical jump, that could be used in real life setting to detect ACL injury risks. Practitioners can simply apply these tests into their programming and simply take a video recording and later analyze it and take notes on whatever they think may lead to the athlete suffering an ACL injury and putting into place injury prevention strategies. So in my opinion, that is a more practical way to use the findings by Hewitt et al. In 2005, noticing knee valgus in these types of tests that Andy Franklin Miller has established could lead to less ACL injuries. What I mean is that instead of taking your athletes to a university and getting them to a 3D biomechanics lab, you could use the single leg squat or the drop landing jump or the standing vertical jump in a more practical setting, and it takes less time, it's cost effective, and you can involve the athletes as well. That's more of a practical way than the 3D biomechanical analysis. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. If leave any questions down in the comments below if you have any questions, and thank you.